Welcome to today's participant direction training, where we discuss budgeting and pay rate setting for Choice's home care attendant service. We'll be covering the following topics: employer and budget authority, determining the budget, annual raises, and documentation. A quick disclaimer before getting started. The term individual is used in this training to refer to the passport consumer. This could mean the passport consumer and/or their designated representative if they have one. First up, we'll do a quick review of employer and budget authority. Per the passport waiver application, the individual has both employer and budget authority under the Choice's home care attendant service. Appendix E of the waiver application outlines the individual's responsibilities for both. Budget authority, which includes determining provider wages, is the focus of today's training. Before we dive into this, I wanted to provide a brief comparison of employer authority and budget authority. Under employer authority, the individual is responsible for tasks such as recruiting and hiring staff, determining work duties and schedules, supervising staff, and discharging staff, more of the day-to-day employer responsibilities. While under a budget authority, the individual is responsible for tasks such as determining staff hourly pay rates and reviewing and approving provider invoices. Today's focus is budget authority with a strong emphasis on determining staff hourly pay rates. Budget authority means an individual has the authority and responsibility to manage their Choice's home care attendant service budget, which includes determining the provider's hourly pay rate. The individual's budget includes the individual's service needs, the provider's hourly pay rate determined by the individual, and employer taxes, including state, federal, and local taxes, and premiums for workers' compensation and unemployment compensation insurance. The two participant-directed services for personal care-like service are Choice's home care attendant service and consumer-directed personal care service. In Choice's home care attendant service, the individual has both employer and budget authority. Because the individual has budget authority in this service, the provider's wage is flexible and determined by the individual with some limitations. In consumer-directed personal care service, the individual has employer authority only, which means the individual does not determine their staff wages, and it is a wage set by the state. Because of this distinct difference, this training applies to Choice's home care attendant service only. Next up, we will discuss how to determine the individual's budget, including setting the provider's hourly pay rate in more detail. This section will be the focus of this training. Here's a quick overview of how to determine an individual's budget. The following slides will go into each step in more detail. To summarize, first you'll complete an assessment to determine the approved number of hours. Then you'll determine the provider's hourly pay rate. Based on the hourly pay rate, you'll determine the provider's billable rate based on the hourly pay rate. These two steps typically occur together. You'll then complete and submit the employer-employee agreement. Next, you'll enter the service authorization in the service plan. Last, we'll go into more detail on how the individual monitors and manages their budget. Before we dive into the details of these steps, let's first make a plug for the ODA resource labeled PAA Budgeting and Pay Rate Setting Guide. This is an ODA resource that walks the PAA through the steps that are described in this training. It was designed to be a quick reference to guide the PAA outside of this more in-depth training. You can refer to this document as needed during the budgeting and pay rate setting process. The first step is to determine the number of hours that can be approved. Use discretion with completing this step in the process. Depending on the situation, you may already know how many hours are approved, so this step can be skipped if it's already been done recently. To determine the approved number of Choice's home care attendant service hours, use your PAA's internal process to complete an assessment of the individual's needs based on the allowable tasks under the Choices Home Care Attendant Service Rule, OAC 173-39-02.4, Section A. Ideally, Choices Home Care Attendant Service is authorized as a monthly number of hours instead of daily or weekly as commonly done with an agency provider. Why do this? This gives the individual more flexibility and autonomy on how they use their hours, which is ideal in a self-directed model. There may be scenarios where a monthly budget does not make sense. For example, the provider has reached their maximum 40 hours per week allowed in rule. But a monthly authorization is best practice whenever possible. To determine the monthly number of hours, simply multiply the number of hours per week by 4.3. On the occasion you are authorizing 40 hours per week, multiply the number of weekly hours by 4.5 instead. When determining the number of hours that can be approved, be mindful of limitations in the Choices Home Care Attendant Service Rule, OAC 173-39-02.4, Section B-2, which states a participant-directed provider may not provide service to more than 5 individuals per week, no more than 40 hours per week to any one individual, or more than 56 hours per week to multiple individuals. If Choices Home Care Attendant Service is unable to fulfill all the assessed number of hours, discuss the individual's options, which can include using an agency to supplement the hours that cannot be covered under Choices Home Care Attendant Service, hiring another provider through Choices Home Care Attendant Service, adult day service, home-delivered meals, informal supports, etc. Backup planning should also be discussed with the individual. This will include how the individual's needs will be met if passport services cannot fulfill the individual's assessed needs, or how their needs will be met if there is a gap or delay in their services. Lastly, a quick note on payer source considerations. It is best practice to discuss Medicaid state plan as a service option, but ultimately, if an individual is choosing Choices Home Care Attendant Service, then state plan does not have to be used first. The reason state plan is not being used should be documented and care planned. Step 2. Determine the provider's hourly pay rate. We'll start with some best practices and FYIs for having the discussion about the hourly pay rate. First, and most importantly, the hourly pay rate is ultimately the individual's decision, and therefore, the conversation should occur with the individual directly. This conversation should occur on the clinical operations side at the PAA and not the provider oversight side, and therefore it's a collaborative discussion between the individual and their case manager. The provider can be present for this discussion if the individual chooses, but should not be between the case manager and provider only. Now it's time to have the pay rate setting discussion with the individual. It's important to have a starting point, and the pay rate range is a great place to begin the conversation. The provider's hourly pay rate must be at least Ohio's minimum wage and no more than the state's maximum rate set in OAC 5160-1-06.1 Appendix A. In 2025, this range is $10.70 an hourly pay rate and $30.92 billable rate. Billable rate is emphasized here as it's different from hourly pay rate. The next slide provides a quick overview of hourly pay rate versus billable rate, as it's crucial to understand this while having the pay rate setting discussion. The hourly pay rate is the provider's hourly wage, while the billable rate includes the provider's hourly pay rate and the employer taxes. Employer taxes include state, federal, and local taxes, and premiums for workers' compensation and unemployment compensation insurance. As a quick aside, the hourly pay rate is the provider's hourly pay rate before employee taxes come out. The billable rate only accounts for the employer's taxes. The employee will still have taxes taken out of their paycheck like a typical W-2 employee. Here are some things the individual and case manager should consider during this discussion. The case manager should ensure this is a thorough discussion and the individual has all the information to make an informed decision. The individual should be aware of the minimum and maximum rates described previously. The case manager should come to the discussion prepared with their area's average home health aide wages paid by agency providers and share this with the individual. Unless otherwise requested by the individual, at the very least, a Choices Home Care Attendant Service provider should not make less than the hourly pay rate range of an agency aide. Understanding the minimum, maximum, and average pay rates can be a good place to get started if the individual is unsure about an hourly pay rate. Another point to consider is that by approving the maximum allowable rate, there won't be any flexibility for future pay increases. Leaving space in the budget for pay increases leaves the opportunity to give raises based on performance or cost of living to help with provider retention down the road. About 18% of the billable rate goes towards employer taxes. This will be discussed in detail in a later slide. Another thing to consider is the provider's experience, qualifications, and work challenges. Some include overall challenges in staffing personal care service for the individual, the provider's experience, where the individual lives, challenges of the work duties, work shift needs, etc. Essentially, it is the individual's decision under budget authority to decide what to pay their provider. If it's within the state's minimum and maximum rates, it can be approved. Be mindful of over cost cap and clinical review requirements and follow your internal approval processes when needed. To piggyback off the billable rate conversation, it's also important to understand employer tax rate fluctuations. The billable rate includes the provider's hourly pay rate plus the employer taxes. Employer taxes can fluctuate periodically throughout each year. One that fluctuates regularly each March is the SUI rate. Every individual has a unique SUI rate, which is tied to state unemployment insurance claims. In March, some individuals' employer SUI rates may fluctuate. They can increase, decrease, or remain the same. Other tax rates, such as workers' comp insurance, can also fluctuate each year. Tax rate fluctuations will directly impact the billable rate, and when this happens, the OAC maximum billable rate cannot be exceeded. The next two slides give guidance, things to consider, and best practices to the PAA on how to have this pay rate discussion with the individual. The budget and pay rate setting flyer is a tool developed by ODA that can be shared with the individual to help guide the conversation. If an individual is hiring multiple providers, this hourly pay rate discussion must happen for each individual and each of their providers. The conversation occurs between the case manager and the individual. The case manager reviews the individual's service needs and the provider's experience, qualifications, and potential work challenges. A great place to begin the discussion is by asking the individual what they wish to pay their provider. Sometimes they have an answer, and sometimes they do not. It's a good starting point if they do. The case manager must educate the individual on the current average wages of agency home health aides, the state's minimum wage, and the OAC maximum. The hourly rate chosen must fall within this range and should be competitive with agency aide wages. It's important to communicate the OAC maximum rate is a billable rate maximum and includes the provider's hourly pay rate and employer taxes. Approximately 18% of the billable rate goes towards employer taxes, which includes these tax fluctuations, which will ensure the individual status within the OAC max rate over time. Recommend the individual keeps room for wage growth to allot for future merit raises and cost of living increases to encourage job performance and provider retention. This is recommended but not required. Some questions to consider can include what hourly pay rate is competitive with similar jobs in the individual's community, which will ultimately help with securing and keeping the provider. What hourly pay rate will allow for future pay raises to help keep your provider? What hourly pay rate will secure the provider's employment? Step 3. Determine the provider's billable rate based on the hourly pay rate. This step is done with the previous step. A quick recap of the difference between the provider's hourly pay rate versus billable rate. In summary, the hourly pay rate is the provider's hourly wage before taxes, while the billable rate is the hourly pay rate plus the employer's taxes. As mentioned before, Step 2, determining the provider's hourly pay rate, and Step 3, determining the provider's billable rate, occur together. To determine the billable rate based on the hourly pay rate, you will use the C-HCAS Pay Rate Calculator tool. This is an Excel spreadsheet that will calculate the hourly pay rate plus the taxes for you. First, you'll use the Pay Rate Calculator tool to determine the hourly pay rate with the individual. Here's a short tutorial on how to do this.
All right, so we have the Ohio Passport Pay Rate Calculator tool open. This tool was created to help us easily determine what a billable rate would be based on an hourly pay rate that's determined by the individual. So this is a nice little calculator tool that will do all of the hard tax math for us. So what we want to first focus on is this line number 3, SUI rate. This is really important anytime we're talking about setting an hourly pay rate or figuring out what the billable rate is to enter into the service plan. This SUI rate is going to be very important. So for the purpose of having a discussion with the individual about what they want their provider's pay rate to be, we're going to use a 9% default rate. This 9% gives us a little bit of a buffer. That way, when SUI rates fluctuate throughout the year or some sort of tax change happens, we have room in the individual's budget to accommodate for those fluctuations without pushing anyone over that OAC maximum. So this just gives us space so that way as those fluctuations happen throughout the year, each year, we don't have to worry about that happening. So we have our 9% in there, and now we're ready to start having the discussion with the individual. Now please be mindful this is a tool, so this does not need to be submitted to PPL. This does not need to be saved unless your PAA has that as part of their internal process. This is really just a calculator tool to determine here's the hourly pay rate, this is what the billable rate would be, so that way we can keep the individual under that OAC maximum rate. So we have the 9% in there as the SUI rate, and we're going to scroll down to the next most important line, which is enter the hourly pay rate, this number 8 right here. This is where we can start having the discussion with the individual. So you've had your discussion, and maybe they've said, I want to pay $19 an hour. Can I do that? Well, let's find out. So we just type in $19 an hour as the hourly pay rate. And as you can see, it's done all of the math for us, adding in all of these different employer taxes. So as we can see, we're kind of moving down here, done all the math for us. 2 numbers to point out: total hourly cost to budget. So this is where the billable rate comes in. So with the $19 an hour, the billable rate would be $22.47. So again, it's the hourly rate plus all of the employer taxes equals $22.47 per hour, which then they've done the math for you is a $5.62 per unit. Then, as you can see, they have kind of built into the calculator tool hourly allowable maximum billable rate. So this is that $30.92 from the OAC. And as you can see, $22.47 keeps us well below that billable rate maximum, so this absolutely could be approved by the individual. Now, say the individual says, I want to pay $29 an hour. Well, let's take a look at what that would be. All right, we can see very quickly we have some red down here, which I'll explain. So again, an hourly pay rate of $29 an hour plus all the employer taxes. It looks like the billable rate would be $34.30, which, it does the math for us, quickly puts us over the $30.92 OAC maximum by $3.38. So this could not be approved since it puts us over that maximum. So that is kind of very simple how to quickly determine what can be approved by the individual. Again, we have this 9% to leave a little bit of a buffer for those tax fluctuations that happen each year. And this is the one we enter the hourly pay rate based on those discussions with the individual. And down here will tell us very quickly if it can or cannot be approved. If the individual stays within this $30.92, then ultimately it can be approved.
As you can see, we used a 9% SUI rate to leave a small buffer for employer tax fluctuations each year. Using 9% as the SUI rate leaves about 18% for all the employer taxes. The 18% can help accommodate future tax rate fluctuations. This will ensure that when employer tax rates fluctuate, the provider will not go over the OAC maximum rate. A quick note, you will use 9% here or the individual's SUI rate in their PPL portal profile, whichever is higher, as the SUI rate. Now that you've determined the provider's hourly pay rate with the individual, it's now time to find the billable rate. This is the rate that will be entered into the individual's PIMS service plan. Here's a quick tutorial on how to do this.
All right, so we have the Ohio Passport Pay Rate Calculator tool open again. Now we have determined what the hourly pay rate will be with the individual, and now we need to figure out what that billable rate will be so we can enter the service plan line in the individual's PIMS chart. So for this situation, again, the SUI rate is going to be key here. So for an individual that's already enrolled on Choice's home care attendant service, say they're adding a provider or they're changing a provider's pay rate, what we'll want to do is go into the PPL portal under participant profile to find out what that individual's SUI rate is. And that's the SUI rate you'll use. For individuals that are new to Choice's home care attendant service, so they're new to PPL, we're making a referral for them for the first time, we're going to use a 2.7 as their default rate. So in this situation, I'm just going to go ahead and use 2.7. Again, 2.7 or the SUI rate that's in the individual's PPL portal participant profile. Now we're going to scroll down to number 8 again, enter hourly pay rate. So say you spoke with the individual and they've decided on that $19 an hour. So we'll put in $19 an hour. And as we can see, $19 an hour, it's done all the math by adding in all of the employer taxes. As you can see here, state unemployment is where the SUI rate was entered in, 2.7%. We come down here and it comes to $21.27 an hour, which is $5.32 per unit. So very easily we can see that the $5.32 based on our 2.7 SUI rate will be the billable unit rate that will be entered into the service plan.
As noted in the tutorial, you will use 2.7% as the SUI rate for individuals new to Choice's home care attendant service. The cost to employer with instructions document can be used as a quick reference for those with 2.7% SUI rate. For individuals already enrolled on Choice's home care attendant service, use the SUI rate in the individual's PPL portal chart. To find the SUI rate for a current Choice's home care attendant service individual, log into the PPL portal, search the individual under Participant Search, click Participant Profile, and the SUI rate can be found under the Employer Record section. When entering the billable unit rate into the service authorization, you can round up or add a buffer to the billable rate as needed. Step 4. Complete and submit the Employer-Employee Agreement. The Employer-Employee Agreement is an ODA form that communicates the provider's hourly pay rate to PPL, while the service authorization in PIMS communicates the billable rate to PPL. Here's a short tutorial on completing the agreement.
All right, so we've opened up the Passport Participant Directed Services Employer-Employee Agreement. This agreement is completed with the case manager, the individual or their designated representative, and their provider. This document will be submitted to PPL, and this is our way to inform PPL of the hourly pay rate that was determined by the individual. So it's a pretty simple document. You'll start by filling out just basic information above, the name of the employer, so that's going to be the consumer's name. We're going to use a fake one here, John Doe, and then their employee's name or their provider. And then it just has some explanation on exactly what's being agreed upon, kind of what the employee's responsibilities are, what are the employer's responsibilities. And then, for the sake of today's training, we're going over Choice's home care attendant service. So we'll check mark that box. If you were completing this for a consumer-directed personal care service, you'd obviously choose that one instead. And then right here, we're going to put the hourly pay rate that we determined with the individual. This is not the billable rate, but the rate that was determined by the individual, the hourly pay rate. So for this situation, we chose $19 an hour. And then, and most importantly, this agreement shall be effective on, and then we're going to choose the date. So if this is an individual that's new to Choice's home care attendant service, they're not linked with PPL yet, so we're going to be making a new referral. You can use either the date that this agreement is completed or the date that you complete the PPL referral as the start date. And then once the onboarding happens, an official start date will be decided, but this is just to have a placeholder for that. So we'll choose the date. Say it's an individual that's already linked with Choice's home care attendant service, and maybe we're just increasing the provider's hourly pay rate. So in that situation, we want to be really thoughtful with what this start date is. We never want to backdate here. We always want to choose a future date. And it's ideal, not absolutely required, so there is wiggle room with this, but it is ideal if the new rate can begin at the start of a pay period. So at the 1st of the month or the 16th of the month, if at all possible. So I'm completing this on December 19th, 2023. So I'm going to choose 1/1/2024 as the start date. That's the next pay period, the next start of the pay period, and that's going to be the date that we use. I'm going to be submitting the PPL referral today, so that gives PPL plenty of time to do their back-end work to make sure that increase gets set up in their system. So again, if it's a new participant, a person newly enrolling on Choice's home care attendant service with PPL, you can use the date that you're completing this form or the date that you're completing the PPL referral. For someone that's already linked with PPL, linked with Choice's home care attendant service, we just want to use a future date, preferably the start of a pay period, the 1st or the 16th of the month. And then from there, everyone signs, the employer designated representative, the employee, and the case manager, and that's everybody agreeing to the hourly pay rate and the start date. And I would be mindful if it's a new individual where you still need to make the PPL referral and PPL still needs to do their onboarding. I would just let them know that the onboarding still needs to occur before an official start date can be set, so they know that there is still a little bit more time before they can start service and start getting paid. And that is the employer-employee agreement.
The next two slides are some things to be mindful of when completing the employer-employee agreement. This form must be completed and submitted to PPL to communicate a provider's hourly pay rate to PPL. It is submitted to PPL with a new referral when initially setting the provider's hourly pay rate or when changing a current provider's hourly pay rate. It is not completed if a tax fluctuation changes the billable rate. The date the agreement takes effect is the date you want the hourly pay rate to go into effect. For new referrals, the date the agreement is completed can be used. When changing a current provider's hourly pay rate, the date the hourly pay rate takes effect must be after the form is sent to PPL. It's recommended the hourly pay rate takes effect at the beginning of a pay period. For example, the 1st or the 16th of the month. Do not backdate unless previously discussed with ODA. Ensure the effective date and hourly pay rate is communicated with the individual. Follow your PAA's internal process to submit the agreement to PPL. Step 5. Enter the service authorization in the service plan. Now it's time to enter the Choices Home Care Attendant Service authorization into the individual service plan. We'll start with reviewing some important details to include in the service authorization. For new referrals, you should add the service authorization in the service plan when the PPL referral is made. For existing participants, update the service plan and use the start date entered on the employer-employee agreement for the new service authorization line. For the unit rate, enter the billable unit rate determined with the OH Passport Calculator tool. In the comments section, enter the number of approved hours and hourly pay rate. For new referrals, once the good to go is received from PPL, update the provider's start date in the service authorization to the start date determined with the individual. Here's a quick tutorial on entering a service authorization into the service plan.
Okay, we're in the individual service plan, and we're in the second tab labeled Services. And now we want to add the Choices Home Care Attendant Service to the service plan. So we're going to start with adding the line, choosing your service like you typically would when adding a new service. We're going to choose, obviously here, Choices Home Care Attendant Service, funding source Passport, and then we're going to double click in here so we can add more details. So I'm going to start here at the top under comments. Always a best practice to add the provider's hourly pay rate here, since the rate that we add here is going to be the billable rate unit. It's nice to have the hourly pay rate here so it's easily accessible to yourself or anyone else that's in the chart that may be needing that information. So I'm going to stick with the $19 hourly pay rate. And then sometimes it's helpful to add in the number of hours that are authorized. So let's just say if they're using the max allowable of the 40 hours a month, that would be a good place to have it here as well. And then any other comments that you think would be helpful or necessary for that specific individual. I'm going to jump to the unit rate. So again, this is going to be the billable rate. So kind of going back to that calculator tool that we used a little bit earlier, the $19 an hour pay rate would calculate to $21.35 billable hourly rate, which then equals $5.34 per unit. So that's what we're going to enter there. Again, this is the billable unit rate. This is the provider hourly pay rate. We use the calculator tool to get this $5.34 based on the $19. Now we're going to jump down to frequency. I'm going to choose monthly since it's always encouraged to do a monthly authorization whenever possible, just because that gives the individual more flexibility over how they're using that service authorization. So you'll enter the units, which goes back to your kind of original assessment of what the individual's needs are and what that equals out to on a monthly basis in this situation. So I'm just kind of entering a random number. And then the period start date and end date. So the start date is going to be whatever start date you determined with the individual. So again, just kind of putting in a random day here. But again, that would be the date you decide with the individual. Through the service plan we will use. And then you'll go ahead and add your provider. I'm in a test site right now, so unfortunately there's no providers to choose from, but you would choose your provider, the begin and end date, and then you've got all of the information. As you can see, a lot of this information was gathered from this process we've been going over. The hourly pay rate, what the billable rate is, how many hours we're approving, what the start date is. So all of that information is now in here, and we've got our service authorization. It's now in there, and then it should show up in the PPL portal the following business day. And then, yep, you've got your service authorization all set.
Once a service authorization is entered in the individual service plan, a service authorization report, or a SAR, is automatically generated and sent to PPL the following business day. PPL then uploads it into their system, which is reflected in the PPL portal under the individual service authorization. It is important to know this is occurring in the background. If what you have in the PIMS service plan is not reflected in the PPL portal, then a problem may have occurred with this SAR file process. Reach out to the ODA Participant Direction mailbox for support if this occurs. Step 6. Monitoring and managing the budget. Lastly, here is guidance for how the individual, with support from the case manager, monitors and manages their budget. The individual should know what is authorized in their service plan and is responsible for authorizing and approving their provider's service based on this. It is the case manager's responsibility to provide education and support during this process as needed. The individual sets the schedule with their provider and chooses the work tasks that are completed for each work shift. Additional case manager approval is not needed if the individual is staying within their approved service authorization. The individual is responsible for reviewing and approving their provider's timesheets and task information each pay period. Lastly, the FMS provider handles the state, federal, and local taxes and premiums for workers' compensation and unemployment compensation insurance for the individual. A percentage of the billable rate goes towards these costs. To recap, here's the step-by-step overview of how to determine an individual's budget that was reviewed in the previous slides. First, you'll determine the approved number of hours for Choice's home care attendant service. Then you'll determine the provider's hourly pay rate. Based on the hourly pay rate, you'll determine the provider's billable rate. These steps typically occur together. You'll then complete and submit the employer-employee agreement to PPL. Next, you'll enter the service authorization in the service plan. Lastly is the ongoing monitoring and managing of the individual's budget. Once the individual sets their provider's hourly pay rate, it's best practice to discuss the option of an annual raise with the individual. ODA's PAA budgeting and pay rate setting guide can be used to guide this process. Annual raises can be assessed at the individual's annual assessment or another time determined by the individual. 1 to 3% hourly pay rate increase annually to accommodate cost of living increases and/or performance is a best practice. If the provider is already at the OAC maximum rate, an annual increase would not be an option. Lastly, always be mindful of the state's minimum wage and maximum billable rate. To close out the training, we will touch briefly on documentation. Be sure to document the applicable details of these discussions in the individual's case notes. This includes, but is not limited to, the assessed number of Choice's home care attendant service hours, the provider's hourly pay rate determined by the individual, and any details that led to the decision, backup and service plan, the details of the FMS referral and/or submission of the employer-employee agreement to PPL, and when the good to go was received. This concludes today's participant direction training over budget authority for Choice's home care attendant service. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a good day.